I was shocked when the court declared the child I raised for 7 years was not mine. The sterile atmosphere of the courtroom was almost suffocating, the weight of the judge's words hanging heavy in the air. I sat rigid, my hands gripping the edges of the wooden bench as if anchoring myself to reality. The words reverberated in my mind, refusing to settle. Lucas, the boy I had raised and loved unconditionally for 7 years, was not biologically mine. The DNA evidence had spoken, and the truth it revealed was a sharp, unforgiving blade. Time seemed to slow as my gaze darted between the faces in the room. My wife, Rachel, sat to my right, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She avoided my eyes, her posture tense, as though bracing for the storm she knew was coming. My eyes shifted to Lucas, who sat quietly, his small legs swinging innocently beneath the bench. The boy's obliviousness to the proceedings made the revelation all the more cruel. Lucas was still my son in every way that mattered, except the one the court had just declared paramount. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over me, each one more overwhelming than the last. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I tried to piece together how this could have happened. Betrayal burned hot in my chest, the trust one had placed in Rachel now splintered beyond repair. But it was heartbreak that threatened to undo me. Lucas was my son. I had been there for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every moment of joy and frustration. Yet, the foundation of our bond had been irreparably shaken. The courtroom, filled with murmurs and rustling papers, felt distant and unreal. My world had narrowed to the raw, unfiltered pain coursing through me. I wanted to shout, to demand answers. But no words came. I was paralyzed, trapped in a moment that seemed both endless and too fleeting to comprehend. Every memory of Lucas played like a reel in my mind, the first steps, the infectious giggles, the quiet moments of fatherly pride. Were those moments now tainted by this revelation? Could I ever see them the same way again? My focus returned to Rachel, the woman I had loved and trusted. Her face remained a mask, betraying none of the emotions I desperately searched for. Had she known? Had she lied to me all these years? The thought made my stomach churn. A bitter mixture of anger and sorrow. Yet, despite everything, I couldn't fully turn my anger on her. Not yet. The weight of the revelation was too heavy to allow for clarity. Lucas's innocence in all of this only deepened my turmoil. The boy's wide eyes scanned the room, blissfully unaware of the life-altering truth being unraveled around him. My heart ached as I wondered how I could ever explain this to Lucas. How could I tell a child that the father he'd known his whole life wasn't truly his? Would it matter to Lucas? Did it even matter to me? As the judge's voice droned on, summarizing the implications of the DNA results, I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I heard the legal jargon about custody and parental rights, but it all sounded distant, as though spoken from the other end of a long tunnel. None of it addressed the questions that consumed me. What did this mean for my relationship with Lucas? Could I still be a father to the boy who had been the center of my world? The proceedings ended, but I remained seated, unable to move. The gavel's strike felt like the closing of a chapter one hadn't been prepared to finish. As people shuffled out of the courtroom, my world stood still, the enormity of the moment rendering me motionless. I felt as though I were drowning, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of grief, anger, and uncertainty. Rachel finally stood. Her movements slow and deliberate. She placed a tentative hand on Lucas's shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. I watched them go, my feet rooted to the floor. I knew I had to follow. But every step felt like a monumental effort. The space between me and my family, no, my former family, felt insurmountable. The life I thought I knew had been torn apart, and I was left standing in the wreckage, unsure of how to begin piecing it back together. Looking back, my life once felt perfect. I adored Rachel, whose warmth and laughter had made our house a home. Lucas, our bright and energetic son, was my pride and joy. He filled our days with light, his endless curiosity and boundless affection making every challenge seem worthwhile. We were a family, tightly knit, and I had believed that nothing could unravel the bonds we had built together. Those memories were now tinged with an ache I couldn't ignore, the shadow of what I had lost staining their brightness. But perfection is fragile, and cracks began to appear where I least expected them. About 6 months ago, Rachel's behavior started to change. She began working late more often, her shifts extending into the hours when Lucas and I had already settled in for the night. Weekends, once filled with family outings and shared meals, became solitary for Lucas and me. Rachel would excuse herself with vague explanations, leaving the house early and returning well past dinner. Her warmth, once a source of comfort, seemed to cool, replaced by an emotional distance I couldn't bridge. At first, I tried to rationalize her behavior. Work had become demanding. I told myself. Everyone goes through stressful periods, and Rachel had always taken pride in her career. But as the weeks turned into months, the excuses felt increasingly hollow. The rhythm of our family life had shifted, and the changes left an unease I couldn't shake. Conversations with Rachel became curt and transactional, devoid of the connection we once shared. It was as though an invisible wall had risen between us, and I couldn't find a way to break it down. Then came the discovery, a moment that would shatter any illusions I had been clinging to. It happened on an ordinary evening. Rachel had left her purse on the kitchen counter, something she rarely did. As I tidied up, I noticed the edge of a small box peeking out from its unzipped compartment. Curiosity, tinged with a gnawing sense of foreboding, compelled me to look closer. When I pulled the box free, my stomach dropped. It was a pack of condoms. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. My mind racing to make sense of what I was holding. 1,000 questions flooded my thoughts, each one more damning than the last. Rachel and I had long since stopped using contraception. There was no reason for these to be in her possession. The realization struck like a blow, planting the first seed of doubt in my marriage. My hands trembled as I placed the box back where I had found it. My mind already spiraling with suspicion. In that moment, the foundations of my world shifted. The family I had cherished, the life I had built, now seemed precarious, balanced on the edge of a revelation I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to confront Rachel, to demand answers, but fear held me back. What if my worst suspicions were true? What if this discovery was the beginning of the end? I spent the following days in a haze, replaying every interaction, every moment that might have hinted at this betrayal. The subtle changes in Rachel's behavior no longer seemed benign, they were pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Her late nights, her absences, her emotional distance, all of it pointed to something I could no longer ignore. Doubt seeped into every corner of my mind, a constant, unwelcome companion. And yet, amidst the turmoil, there was Lucas. His laughter, his unshakable belief in the stability of our family, became a bittersweet reminder of what was at stake. He deserved the life we had promised him. The security and love of two parents united. For his sake, I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, even as my world threatened to collapse around me. The pack of condoms remained a silent accusation. A symbol of the distance that had grown between Rachel and me. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not yet. Instead, I carried the weight of my suspicions alone, uncertain of how to move forward. The life I had once considered perfect now felt like a fragile illusion, and I was left grappling with the question I dreaded most: had it all been a lie? The doubts that had been gnawing at me for weeks became impossible to ignore. Every late night, every vague excuse, every moment of distance between Rachel and me felt like pieces of a puzzle I was too afraid to solve. But fear couldn't hold me back forever. One evening, as Rachel left the house with the same cryptic explanation she had given so many times before, I decided to follow her. The need for answers had grown unbearable. Under the cover of twilight, I trailed her car, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. She drove to a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people went to avoid being seen. I parked a short distance away and watched as she entered, my stomach churning. Minutes later, a man joined her at the table, young, confident, and far too familiar with her. Their interaction was easy, intimate in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a casual meeting, it was an affair. The sight was a blow I wasn't prepared for. No matter how much I had suspected it. The life I thought I knew crumbled in that moment, replaced by a cold, stark reality. I didn't stay to watch any longer. Seeing them together was enough. I drove home in a haze, the image of Rachel laughing with another man etched into my mind like a scar. When she returned later that night, I was waiting. The confrontation was inevitable. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally breaking. As soon as she stepped through the door, the tension between us ignited. My anger, my hurt, my betrayal, all of it spilled out in a torrent she couldn't ignore. I demanded answers, demanded to know how long this had been going on, demanded to understand why she had betrayed me. Rachel's initial reaction was denial, as though dismissing my accusations would make them disappear. She tried to downplay what I had seen, weaving excuses that only deepened my anger. But I had evidence, undeniable and irrefutable. The weight of it crushed her defenses, leaving her no choice but to admit the truth. The words came reluctantly, dripping with guilt and defiance in equal measure. The argument escalated rapidly, voices rising and overlapping in a cacophony of pain and blame. Every word felt like a weapon. Every accusation cutting deeper than the last. The air between us was charged, heavy with years of love now twisted into anger and disappointment. We were two people fighting not just about the present but about the past. About the fractures in our relationship that had gone unnoticed until now. Then, in the midst of our chaos, a small, frightened voice cut through the noise. Lucas, awakened by our shouting, stood in the hallway, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. The sight of him silenced us both, the weight of what we were doing crashing down on us like a wave. In that moment, the reality of our actions hit me harder than any of Rachel's betrayals. Lucas didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to see his parents tearing each other apart. Rachel hurried to Lucas. Her attempts to comfort him only underscoring the fractured state of our family. I stood frozen, my anger momentarily eclipsed by guilt and shame. The damage had been done, and there was no taking it back. Whatever else I felt about Rachel's betrayal, one thing was clear: Lucas was the one who would suffer the most from our failures. And that knowledge was almost more than I could bear. In the days following my confrontation with Rachel, I found myself lost in a haze of confusion and pain. The betrayal had shaken me to my core, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about my life and my family. Despite the overwhelming emotions, I knew I couldn't navigate this alone. Seeking clarity, I turned to Sarah, my closest friend, someone who had been a steady presence in my life for years. Sarah listened as I recounted the events that had unraveled my world, her face a mix of concern and sadness. When I finished, she hesitated for a moment before suggesting something that stopped me cold: the possibility that Lucas might not be my biological child. Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap, impossible to ignore yet too devastating to fully process. My initial reaction was one of outright rejection. The idea seemed absurd. Lucas was 7 years old, and Rachel's current affair was with a much younger man. There was no timeline in which this possibility made sense. But the seed of doubt had been planted. And try as I might, I couldn't shake it. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Rachel's distant behavior over the past months now seemed like part of a larger pattern. One that stretched back further than I had initially considered. Memories of small, seemingly insignificant moments resurfaced, each one now tinged with suspicion. I tried to push these thoughts away. But they clung to me, persistent and insidious. I spent sleepless nights grappling with my doubts, torn between my love for Lucas and the need for answers. Every time I looked at him, I felt a pang of guilt for even entertaining the thought. He was my son in every way that mattered. I had been there for his first steps, his first words, every scraped knee and bedtime story. To question his place in my life felt like a betrayal of everything we had built together. And yet, the uncertainty gnawed at me, a constant undercurrent to my grief and anger. Eventually, I came to a painful realization: I couldn't move forward without knowing the truth. The doubts, left unchecked, would fester and grow, poisoning whatever remained of my family. As much as I wanted to protect Lucas from the fallout, I knew that my ability to be the father he needed depended on my ability to confront this possibility head-on. And so, reluctantly, I decided to pursue a paternity test. The decision brought with it a fresh wave of turmoil. Agreeing to the test felt like crossing a line, one that I couldn't uncross. It was an admission that the doubts had taken root. That my faith in Rachel and in the life we had built was no longer enough. I tried to rationalize my choice, telling myself that the test was a necessary step toward clarity, but the guilt remained. Every interaction with Lucas felt heavy with unspoken tension, my love for him battling against the questions I couldn't suppress. As the day of the test approached, I found myself oscillating between hope and dread. Part of me clung to the belief that the results would confirm what I had always known, that Lucas was my son. But another part, darker and more fearful, braced for the possibility that my worst suspicions would be confirmed. I tried to prepare myself for either outcome, but the truth was, no amount of preparation could soften the impact of what was to come. The test itself was a simple procedure, over in a matter of minutes. Yet the weight it carried was immeasurable. As I left the clinic, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold. The waiting period stretched endlessly, each passing day amplifying the tension that had settled over my home. Rachel's presence became almost unbearable, her every move a reminder of the betrayal that had brought us to this point. Lucas, oblivious to the storm raging around him, continued to look at me with the same trust and love he always had, and it was this that cut the deepest. The decision to seek the truth had been mine. But it came with a cost I hadn't fully anticipated. Every moment spent waiting for the results felt like a betrayal of the bond one had with Lucas, a bond that no DNA test could define. Yet, despite the guilt and the pain, I held on to the hope that clarity, no matter how painful, would be the first step toward healing. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, a sterile environment that felt worlds away from the warmth and intimacy of family life. I sat in stunned silence as the judge read the results of the paternity test, his voice steady and detached. The words hit me like a hammer. Lucas was neither my biological son nor the child of Rachel's current lover. The revelation shattered the fragile hope I had clung to, leaving me adrift in a sea of disbelief. I could barely process the implications. Lucas, the boy I had raised, loved, and cherished for 7 years, was not my son. He wasn't even connected to the men who had come between Rachel and me. The truth was more devastating. He was the child of another man Rachel had been involved with before we were married. A secret she had kept hidden all this time. The realization twisted in my chest like a knife, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. As the judge continued speaking, the words blurred together, their meaning lost amidst the whirlwind of emotions that consumed me. Betrayal, anger, heartbreak, each feeling surged to the surface, colliding and overlapping until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. I felt as though the foundation of my life had been ripped away, leaving me grasping at fragments of a reality I no longer recognized. I glanced at Rachel, hoping to find some explanation, some shred of remorse in her expression. But her face remained a mask, her eyes fixed on the floor. The woman I had trusted with my heart and my life had lied to me in the most profound way. The weight of her deception was suffocating, a betrayal that tainted every memory, every moment we had shared as a family. I couldn't help but question the authenticity of our entire relationship. Had any of it been real? Or had it all been built on a foundation of lies? My gaze shifted to Lucas, sitting innocently beside her. He looked at me with the same trust and love he always had, unaware of the storm that had just erupted around him. My heart ached as I thought of him, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy whose laughter had filled our home with joy. He was innocent in all of this, yet his very existence was now a painful reminder of Rachel's betrayal. I didn't know how to reconcile my love for him with the truth of his origins. Was he still my son, even if he wasn't mine by blood? Could I continue to be the father he needed, knowing the truth? The courtroom emptied around me, but I remained seated, frozen in place. My thoughts raced, a chaotic tangle of anger and sorrow, guilt and confusion. I felt betrayed not just by Rachel but by the very fabric of my life. The family I had poured my heart into. The life I had worked so hard to build, now felt like a cruel illusion. As the weight of the revelation settled over me, I found myself questioning everything. Had Rachel ever loved me? Or had I simply been a convenient solution to a problem she couldn't face alone? And what of Lucas? I had been his father in every way that mattered, but now I wasn't sure where I stood. The bond we shared had been built on love, not biology, but could that love withstand the truth? The drive home was a blur, the silence in the car oppressive. Rachel and Lucas sat in the back seat, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. I couldn't bring myself to look at Rachel, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal that had upended my life. Lucas, oblivious to the turmoil, hummed softly to himself, his innocence both comforting and heartbreaking. When we arrived home, I retreated to my room, closing the door against the world. The weight of everything bore down on me, a crushing force that left me gasping for air. I thought of Lucas, of the life we had shared, and the love I still felt for him. That love hadn't changed. But the context had, and I didn't know how to move forward. My heart ached with the knowledge that my relationship with him would never be the same, no matter how much I wanted it to be. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too raw. As much as I wanted to focus on Lucas, to be the father he deserved, I couldn't ignore the pain Rachel had caused. Her deception had fractured our family, leaving me to pick up the pieces while she remained distant, unrepentant. The path ahead felt impossibly steep, but I knew I couldn't stay in this place of anger and despair forever. For Lucas's sake, I had to find a way forward, even if I wasn't sure where that path would lead. The days that followed the courtroom revelation were some of the most challenging I've ever faced. Knowing Lucas was not my biological son did not diminish the love I had for him, but it added a layer of complexity to every interaction. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, coloring moments that once felt simple and pure. Lucas's laughter, his trust, his unwavering belief that I was his father in every sense of the word, these were both my solace and my torment. I loved him deeply, but I couldn't escape the questions that now haunted me. What did it mean to be a father when the bond one thought was unbreakable had been built on a lie? As the weeks wore on, Rachel and I reached an inevitable decision. Divorce was the only path forward. The betrayal had created a chasm between us that could not be bridged, and neither of us had the energy or desire to try. Rachel, now fully immersed in her new relationship, seemed almost relieved by the decision. Her focus shifted entirely, and with it, her interest in parenting dwindled. Lucas, once the center of her world, was now an afterthought, a responsibility she appeared eager to shed. This left me with a choice I never imagined I'd have to make. Custody of Lucas was a question I couldn't avoid, even as my heart wrestled with the implications. On one hand, he was my son in every way that mattered. I had raised him, cared for him, and loved him unconditionally. On the other hand, the knowledge that he wasn't biologically mine complicated everything. Could I continue to be the father he needed, knowing the foundation of our relationship was not what I had believed it to be? Ultimately, the decision was not mine alone. Rachel's indifference left me with no real alternative. Lucas needed stability, and despite my doubts and inner conflict, I knew I was the only one who could provide it. Taking full custody of him was both a daunting responsibility and an act of love. It was a commitment to the bond we had built, a declaration that my role in his life transcended the circumstances of his birth. Adjusting to life as a single father was far from easy. The divorce left its scars, and Rachel's absence in Lucas's life created new challenges. He asked about her less and less as time went on. But I could see the questions in his eyes, the unspoken confusion about why she was no longer around. I did my best to shield him from the pain of her rejection, but there were moments when the weight of it all felt insurmountable. Raising a child alone required a strength I wasn't sure I possessed, yet every time I looked at Lucas, I found a reason to keep going. Our days became a series of small victories and quiet struggles. I learned how to navigate parent-teacher conferences, bedtime routines, and the endless questions that came with raising a curious 7-year-old. Lucas's resilience amazed me. Despite everything, he remained a bright, loving child, his spirit unbroken by the upheaval around him. It was his strength that inspired me to push through my own doubts and fears. Over time, the internal conflict began to ease. The truth of Lucas's parentage no longer felt like a shadow looming over our relationship. Instead, it became a part of our story. A reminder that love is not defined by blood but by the choices we make every day. Choosing to be Lucas's father was the most important decision I had ever made, and it was one I made anew each morning. The bond we shared was not something that could be undone by a DNA test. It was built on years of shared experiences, on the countless moments that made us a family. Rachel's absence remained a painful reality. But it also reinforced the importance of my role in Lucas's life. I was his anchor, the one constant in a world that had been anything but stable. And in being that for him, I found a sense of purpose that transcended the pain of betrayal and the uncertainty of the future. Lucas was my son, not because of biology but because I chose to love him, and that choice was more powerful than anything else. Life with Lucas after the court ruling felt like navigating uncharted waters. Every moment, every gesture, carried a weight it hadn't before. I found myself questioning my actions in ways I never had. Was I hugging him too tightly because I loved him, or because I feared losing him? Was my patience in teaching him something genuine? Or an overcompensation for the doubts that now lingered in the back of my mind? These questions haunted me, turning even the simplest interactions into a battlefield of emotions. Lucas, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging within me. To him, nothing had changed. I was still Dad, the man who tucked him in at night, cheered for him at his school events, and taught him how to tie his shoelaces. His unwavering trust was both a source of comfort and an unbearable weight. Every smile, every laugh, reminded me of the bond we shared, yet also underscored the shadow of the truth that hung over us. His innocence made my internal conflict even harder to bear. He deserved stability, love, and a father who could give him both without hesitation. But the court's revelation had shaken me to my core. I couldn't unlearn the truth, couldn't banish the lingering questions about who Lucas truly was and what role I should play in his life now. The duality of my feelings, unwavering love for him and the sting of betrayal from his origins, pulled at me constantly, leaving me exhausted and uncertain. Despite my inner turmoil, I resolved to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Lucas. He didn't need to carry the burden of my doubts. Every day, I reminded myself that love wasn't about biology but about choice. And I had chosen to love Lucas long before I knew the truth. Yet, even as I clung to this conviction, the shadow of betrayal lingered, making each day a delicate balance between the father I had always been and the man grappling with the scars of deception.